Something I think about a lot is how can researchers really know if the specific thing they're testing, their intervention, is actually the thing making the difference? It seems so hard to isolate.
That's a great question. And yeah, it is hard. The key really lies in what we call research design.
Research design. Okay.
Yeah, think of it like the blueprint for a study. It's the systematic way they set things up to try and get answers that are, well, valid and reliable.
Right. And our source for this deep dive, this lecture on quantitative research design, it mentions three big goals for that blueprint. Answering the question well, doing it consistently.
Reliably, yeah.
Reliably, right?
Yeah.
And the third one, the one we're really digging into today, is internal validity. Basically, being sure your cause and effect claim is actually accurate.
Exactly. And that's our mission here, to unpack how researchers try, and it is a try, to control for all those other things that could be influencing the results. We're using the lecture's points to guide us.
Okay, let's get into it then. So one of the big problems is what the lecture calls spurious effects. Sounds kind of academic, but what does it actually mean?
It's basically just other potential causes, other independent variables that might be affecting your outcome, the dependent variable besides the main one you're interested in.
Ah, okay. So not the thing you're studying, but something else lurking in the background.
Precisely. The lecture gives this example of teacher turnover and community violence. You might see a link, right? More violence, maybe more teachers leave.
Yeah, it's a little plausible.
But is the violence directly causing teachers to quit? Or could it be other stuff, like maybe school funding is low in those areas, or there's less support from admin, or even just the local economy is struggling? Any of those could also push teachers out.
Right, so many possibilities. And if you don't account for those spurious effects, how can you confidently say it's the violence causing the turnover? It might just be tagging along with these other issues.
Exactly. Controlling for them is crucial for validity, especially that internal validity we mentioned, being able to say A causes B. Without control, your findings are, well, they're shaky. You can't truly isolate the impact of your main variable.
So the million-dollar question, how do researchers control for this stuff? The lecture lays out 4 ways. Let's take the first one. Holding conditions and factors constant. What's that look like?
Okay, so this is about limiting variation, making things the same for everyone involved. The lecture uses the example of testing a new teaching method.
Right.
To hold things constant, you might decide to run your whole study in just one school, maybe even with just one teacher using both the old and new methods.
I see. So by using only one school, one teacher, you're kind of removing school effects or teacher effects as possible explanations for any difference in test scores.
You got it. It makes it clearer in that specific situation whether the teaching method made a difference.
But I sense a but coming.
There is, yeah. The lecture points this out too. While it boosts your internal validity, your confidence about cause and effect there, it can hurt your external validity.
Meaning how well it applies elsewhere.
Exactly. How generalizable are the findings? Just because this method worked in this school with this teacher doesn't mean it'll work in other schools with different teachers, different kids. It's a trade-off.
Okay, makes sense. Sharper focus in one place, but maybe a blurrier picture overall. So what's method number 2 for tackling these spurious effects?
The second way is instead of eliminating factors, you actually build them into the research design. You treat them as additional independent variables you're also interested in.
Okay, how does that work, like with the teaching method example?
Right. So instead of just comparing method A versus method B, you might also look at, say, student ability level. You could split students into high, medium, low ability groups.
Ah,
And then you compare how method A and method B work for each of those ability groups. Or you could add gender as another variable. Does method A work better for boys and method B for girls, or vice versa, or no difference?
so you're not just asking which method is better overall, but which method is better for whom, essentially.
Precisely. You're looking for interactions. But as the lecture notes, this makes everything more complicated.
More moving parts.
Yeah. Your design gets complex, your analysis gets complex, you're comparing lots of different averages. Sometimes you lose that simple, clear picture of the main effect, what researchers call parsimony.
Okay, got it. More detail, but potentially a messier story.
Yeah.
All right, let's move to the third method, randomization. The lecture seems to really emphasize this one. Now, random in everyday talk just means, like, unpredictable, right?
Like, that was random. But in research, it's much more specific. The lecture clarifies this nicely. It's about known probabilities.
Known probabilities.
Think of flipping a fair coin. You don't know if the next flip will be heads or tails, but you know the possibilities are heads or tails, and each has a 50% chance. That's randomness in a research sense, known possible outcomes, known probability for each.
Okay, so it's controlled uncertainty
Mhm.
in a way. How does that help with spurious effects? And wait, the lecture also mentioned distinguishing random sampling from random assignment. That seems important.
Absolutely critical distinction. Random sampling is about how you pick people for your study from the wider population. That's mostly about external validity. Can you generalize your findings back to that population?
Yeah.
Random assignment, which is our focus here for controlling spurious effects, is about what you do after you have your participants. It's how you put them into the different groups within your study, like the group getting teaching method A versus the group getting method B. This is all about internal validity.
Gotcha. Sampling is getting them in the door. Assignment is deciding which room they go into. So how does random assignment work, practically?
It means every single person in your study has an exactly equal chance of ending up in any of the groups. Like flipping that coin for each person. Heads, you get method A. Tails, you get method B.
And why is that so powerful? Why is it considered such a game changer for controlling those other factors?
The magic of random assignment, especially if you have enough people in your study, a decent sample size, is that it tends to spread all those other characteristics out evenly across the groups.
Even things you didn't measure.
Even things you didn't measure. Their background knowledge, their parents' income, their motivation, their gender, all those things that could influence the outcome tend to get balanced out between the groups just by chance.
Huh. So the groups start out, on average, looking pretty similar on all these other potentially confounding variables.
Exactly. So if you then see a difference in test scores between the method A group and the method B group, you can be much more confident that the difference is actually due to the teaching method because those other potential explanations have been sort of neutralized by the randomization.
That makes a lot of sense. So the groups are equivalent before the intervention starts.
On average, yes. That's why the lecture calls randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, the gold standard for sorting out cause and effect. But, and it's a big but,
Ah, the practicalities again?
right. The lecture points out they can be really difficult and expensive to do. You often need large numbers of participants, and sometimes it's just not feasible or ethical, especially in places like schools. Can you imagine telling parents their child was randomly assigned to potentially get a worse teaching method?
Yeah, that's tough sell. You mentioned sample size. The lecture notes it works best with larger samples. What if your groups are small?
If your groups are small, even with random assignment, you have a higher risk that the groups will differ on important stuff just by luck of the draw. You might randomly end up with, say, more motivated kids in one group than the other.
Like flipping a coin only 4 times. You might easily get 3 heads just by chance.
Exactly. The more flips, the more participants, the more likely those random variations are to even out. It's the law of large numbers kicking in.
Okay, so random assignment. Powerful, the gold standard, but needs decent sample size and can be tricky to implement. Got it. What about the fourth method? Statistical control. The lecture just touches on it.
Yeah, it's mentioned as the fourth type, but not explained in depth in the clips we have. Basically, statistical control uses mathematical techniques after you've collected the data. You try to statistically adjust for the influence of variables you suspect might be confounding things, even if you couldn't control them through the design itself.
So it's like using software to mathematically subtract the effect of, say, prior knowledge to get a clearer view of the teaching method's effect.
That's the general idea, yes. It involves techniques like regression analysis, it's another tool, but it relies on assumptions and having measured those potential confounders in the first place.
Right, so we've got these 4 strategies: holding constant, building into the design, randomization, and statistical control. Why is it so important for, people listening to understand these concepts?
Because, honestly, it's fundamental to being able to critically evaluate research you come across. When you see a headline claiming X causes Y, understanding how they tried to control for other factors lets you judge the strength of that claim.
So you can ask, did they use random assignment? If not, how did they try to rule out other explanations?
Exactly. Were spurious effects really dealt with? Asking those questions helps you separate more credible findings from ones that might be, well, less convincing. It makes you a much savvier consumer of information.
It definitely changes how you read things. It's not just about the result, but the journey, the design that got them there.
Absolutely. And that design, especially the thought put into controlling for those other potential causes using these methods we've discussed, particularly randomization when possible, that's what builds confidence in cause and effect conclusions.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive, Here's something to chew on. We've talked about how randomization is the gold standard, but also how hard it can be to actually do it in the real world, especially in messy areas like education or social policy.
Yeah, the challenges are very real.
So thinking about that gap between the ideal and the practical, how should we as listeners weigh evidence from studies that couldn't use randomization? What questions should we always keep in the back of our minds about those potential alternative explanations, even when a study looks pretty solid on the surface?
That's the perfect takeaway question. How do we weigh different kinds of evidence, knowing the strengths and weaknesses of how they were generated? Always keep asking, what else could explain this? How well did they account for it? That critical lens is key.